Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Use Comuni podcast. I am Emilia Mataix Fernández from the International University of Catalonia. And today I am very pleased to have two guests of honor in this interview, Professor Caroline Humfress from St. Andrews and Professor Patrick Olivelle from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Caroline Humfress is a professor in medieval history and co-director of the Institute of Legal and Constitutional Research and the founding current governor of the Master in Legal and Constitutional Studies. She has published widely on ancient, late antique, and medieval law and religion, placing historical questions in dialogue with legal, anthropological, and sociological concepts and approaches. And Professor Patrick Olivelle is a professor of Sanskrit and Indian religions at the University of Texas at Austin, where he has also been head of department. He is also a member of the Oxford Center of Hindu Studies, and his current research focuses on the ancient Indian legal tradition of Dharma Sastra. He has also won several prestigious fellowships, including the Guggenheim, the American Council for Learned Societies, or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome. Thank you very much for being here. So today I have the pleasure of being discussing with our guests their new book, The Cambridge Comparative History of Ancient Law, a groundbreaking volume that is the first comprehensive work in the field of comparative ancient legal history. Collaboratively written by an international team of experts, each chapter redefines key legal concepts, practices, and historical context across 5 major ancient legal traditions. So let me begin with a straightforward question from the opening of your introduction. What is the value of comparison, particularly in the study of ancient law?
So shall I start, Patrick? I just want to say first, thank you so much for inviting us, Emilia, onto this podcast. It really is a genuine pleasure. And I'm looking forward to this exchange of views, this conversation. So I think comparison, maybe the best place to start is by saying that comparison itself is nothing new. All right. So, there has been comparison historical writing and legal writing since all the way back to Herodotus. If you're thinking of the Western historiographical tradition, Herodotus, who takes that fantastic comparison between Greeks and Persians. But I think that what we wanted to do with this volume was something I think is quite unique. So we wanted to produce a comparative history of ancient law that didn't flatten out, all kinds of different approaches, different expertise, different kinds of technical language. And personally, I wanted to do a comparative project that worked with multiple center points, multiple kinds of frames of analysis. So, that quotation that I used at the beginning of the volume, I think Marcel Detienne, the 2008, this wonderful book, Comparing the Incomparable, which I came back to again and again over the long history of this project itself. When he asked, what's the use of comparison? He says, quite simply, he's joined the camp of those who prefer a history that's open to all human societies across time and space. And I think this idea of openness, because obviously all comparison involves choices, but we just wanted to make the choices that had to be made as explicit and kind of open as possible for our readers. So I think we worked throughout 14 years that this project was going. I mean, we always worked in full knowledge that we were seeking to compare the incomparable. I mean, that's, whether we succeeded or not, I think, I leave to the reader. But what really interested me personally throughout this project was just how to position the we who was actually doing the comparison. So this big question, would it be possible in a collaborative academic project to center multiple ancient legal traditions rather than just going for one legal tradition, prioritizing it? And let's face it was always going to be Roman law if that was going to happen, but just prioritizing this one ancient legal tradition as the yardstick against which everything else would be measured. That's kind of what I think we didn't want to do. And that partly explains the sort of the structure and the working methodology that our group came up with.
I would like to turn this question around by asking, what would non-comparative law look like? In other words, I think we should get away from the idea that comparison is somehow unique or unusual phenomenon, but as the norm of all scholarship. Knowing one thing is not knowing anything. So even when you are not actually comparing, if you are doing scholarship, you're always entering a realm of comparison. It is true in natural sciences. It is true in biological sciences. It is true in human sciences. Take a look at languages. When did linguistics as a discipline start? When Europeans discovered Sanskrit and found, oh my God, this is the same or similar to what our languages are. Greek, Latin, etc. So in a sense, I think comparison enriches any kind of scholarship. And without comparison, I think scholarship is weak. And if you go into the absolute non-comparison, because even when you say Roman law, you're also comparing it within Roman world, which is complex, which is long, etc. So in a sense, if you're not comparing, you're not really doing any scholarship. That's where I come from. I had a religious studies background. In the 1960s, when I started my career, comparative religion was a big thing, as if this was something new, and there were departments in America of comparative religion. So in a sense, I would put it back and say comparison should be the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, because it's true that we always need something to compare, to look at and check what actually we are studying. But it's true that comparatism is difficult to do in a good way. I think here you have break lots of boundaries to do that, because, for example, and here I'm going to my second question. One thing that fascinates me here is, like, obviously, as a specialist in Roma law, I tend to look at the Romans. And in fact, in that sense, I'm also biased. So I was really fascinated when you said that you have a deliberate effort to develop a genuinely comparative methodology for each topic, to avoid the tendency of centering Rome, for example, as a center or category for comparison. In that way, you are also escaping this tendency, to center the West as the center. And maybe if it was not your intention from the beginning, in post-colonial theory, that could be more trendy now, actually. So do you have any thoughts on that, actually?
I think Caroline is responsible for some of the uniqueness of our volume. When she asked, when I was writing my article, my chapter, I was trying to stand above the various legal traditions and try to find ways of speaking in an anonymous way from up there. But she said, no, try to do it from where you are. And where I am was from India. So, and she asked everybody to do that, so that I was bringing my center into this comparative process, while others who were my collaborators were providing all the material for me to elaborate. That way, we actually did decenter Rome, in a sense, in our chapters. Yeah.
I don't know if I can kind of elaborate a bit on the methodology, because I think it emerged through this incredible kind of collaborative group work that we all did. And one of the, and I remember our second meeting that took place in Cambridge all those many years ago. And there was a real kind of tension at that second meeting about whether this project was going to be possible. So the initial idea for the project came from our wonderful editor at Michael Sharp, who I would like to name check and say thank you. But then as we began our initial discussions for this, I could see there was so much anxiety around exactly what Patrick has just said, this idea that everyone had to become expert in all of the various different kinds of legal sources and legal terminology that we were using. It's not possible, nor do I think it's desirable. So we started off with 2 test chapters. Remember this, Patrick? So Patrick had one test chapter that was the procedure chapter, and the other test chapter was Timothy Lubin, who worked on status and family as it kind of eventually evolved. And we literally just developed this working methodology where the lead chapter author was the one who decided what went into the chapter and how the chapter was structured. And they did it, as Patrick says, avowedly from their own specialism. And to me, this immediately released all of the tension, because it meant that, if you have someone who's expert in Sanskrit literature writing about procedure, the chapter's structured in terms of how an expert thinking about procedure would structure that chapter, which means that the Romanists, so the next phase of doing all the other chapters, it was exactly this. The lead chapter writer did the structure. Then they got all of the group to say, okay, well, how does this work for the particular tradition that I'm trained in? And sometimes the answer was yes, in which case we had similarities and comparisons. And sometimes the answer was a very firm no. And I think they were the instances that were really, really interesting to me. Why would this structure work for the Sanskrit material, but wouldn't work for the ancient Greek material or the ancient Roman material or whatever. So I think that's how this working methodology came about. But it was definitely, Amelia, as I think you may have intuited, because many years ago, I read Deepak Chakrabarty, I read Provincializing Europe, I read quite a lot of, so I think it was sort of informed by that, even if it wasn't absolutely grounded within that sort of that post-colonial tradition. It certainly has post-colonial ambitions.
Yeah, I think it has been like successful in for what I've seen, because also one thing that I admire from these huge sort of works is not only the amount of legal traditions that you have managed to compare, but also, and here I'm quoting directly from your book, saying, thinking historically about ancient law thus necessitates thinking about change and continuity through time and across multiple changing broader contexts. So it's not only different traditions that need to merge in order to compare. You're also talking about multiple contexts that are moving on time. So how did you grasp that? For me, it's something that stresses me when I'm studying stuff because, again, sorry, I'm talking as a Romanist. I work more with the empire, and then some people ask me things about late antiquity, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on that. And some people who doesn't work in ancient law, they don't understand that. And it's like, no, it's completely different, the way of studying the sources. So I imagine in your case, it should have been something to ask about the different traditions you were looking at.
I think we were very lucky, and I was very lucky in that Patrick was one of my co-editors, David Ibbotson was another of my co-editors, and I think the three of us always envisage, not only having conversations with other experts and scholars, but also putting the source material into conversation. So it's kind of interesting to think of, because when you were asking about our selection of the topics, the way that I think of it is that we developed the methodology first, and then we decided what the topics would be, having begun those conversations. So, and I know we may get onto later what we had to leave out. In terms of reflecting back on the volume, one of the things I think it was impossible to do, and that I can't imagine a way that we could have kind of, brought it in. But I think that this volume is still very much a product of the global north in a way. So I could now completely re-envisage another volume, almost, don't deep breath here, Patrick, doing it again, trying to center it. Yeah, so I know, trying to center, but like it's some kind of global south epistemology, like actually putting our money where putting the money where our mouths are, and actually doing this by doing it according to a different way of thinking about scholarship and including those kind of other voices. But that it would have been a completely different kind of volume. And I think the other thing for me as well, the challenge of the timescales, and that didn't become clear to me until a number of years in. So the fact that source material that we were using, and I think it stretches from, it's about 3,200 BCE to 652 CE. I know that's the Tang code. Thank you to Jeffrey for that. So we've got roughly 3.5 millennia. And if you include the archaeological evidence and the kind of material culture evidence that we use in the property chapter, this pushes this timescale back even further. So, we've got a time span from the late 4th to the late 1st millennium BCE, which is equal to or even longer than the rest of history from the collapse of the Near Eastern civilization to our own. So just trying to get some sense of kind of relative timescales and, beginning points and cutoff points. I remember having a conversation with Patrick and David where we just decided that it had to be a kind of moving feast, that we couldn't say this volume will go from X to Y, Z, kind of points in time, that we had to just go where the evidence took us and where the evidence allowed us while still thinking about gaps. So I think in a way it was the time scales that were my own personal challenge, and then the detail and how much evidence we could use, and that was very much something that was worked out. Does that sound recognizable to you, Patrick?
Yes, and the other side of that story is the very different nature of the evidence and the data coming from different areas. From the Near East, we had contemporary evidence in the form of writing, and especially in terms of contracts and judgments and all that. When it came to India, it was a much later period, and it was much more a meta discourse. We didn't have actual evidence of contracts, of law in a courtroom kind of thing. When you went to China, you had a very different. So it was quite an interesting difference in the evidence, and therefore you could not bring in exact comparisons. But for me, I think the most interesting part of comparative law or comparative anything are the differences that we encounter rather than the similarities. We should go with the expectation of similarities because, after all, we are all human beings living in society, having certain needs, and there should be similar kinds of things. But how human beings in different societies dealt with the problems they had in terms of legal area, that I think is very interesting. Indians did it very differently from Chinese because the China had an empire, just like Rome had an empire. India never had it, except for small periods of time. So how did a society, large area, with small kingdoms interacting with each other, but with a civilization that spanned all of that, with a priesthood, Brahminical, that covered all of that, irrespective of political boundaries? That is a very interesting differences that we come up with.
Actually, I wanted to pick again on what Caroline mentioned on the topics, because it's true that, I mean, in the end, you need to make some choices, and you have chosen more broad topics as law as text or legal science, but then to more concrete things like commerce or procedures. So, uh, what was the rationale behind the choices made? And do you think there are things that you would like to explore more in the future, in case there is in 2040 or something like a volume 2?
So I think, to be completely blunt about this, and this is where the editorial experience comes in, the choice of topics was partly driven by the team that we were able to assemble. So we very much wanted to play to people's strengths, and that meant once we'd identified people who could potentially be lead chapter authors, we also, that to some extent governed what the topic would be, but it would be a mistake to think it was just random. I mean, we had many meetings where Patrick, David and I, and Michael as well, we sat down and we tried to ensure that there was some sort of coverage. If we were going to read this volume ourselves, what would we want to see in there? And we tried very hard to not exclude. So I think in terms of what did we leave out, and honestly, Amelia, this is such a huge list. So we tried to include, gender, right? We had a discussion at one point about whether there should just be a chapter on gender and law, but the decision was taken to try and make gender questions run all the way throughout the volume and avoid the tokenism of just having a chapter on that. And of course, the danger of that then might make it seem that we just left that out, which we tried very hard not to. Slavery is another one. We had big discussions about whether to have a separate chapter on slavery, but we eventually decided that it would run throughout and it would be kind of highlighted in the status and family chapter, because that seemed to us to be something quite peculiar about the ancient world vis-a-vis kind of modern ideas about slavery. I could envisage, if we were ever to do a volume 2, I could envisage maybe a really interesting chapter on animals and law. So, the way in which and this is partly due to a kind of explosion of research in the last 5 years or so, looking at these questions, the environment and law, how all these various different traditions think about the environment. So there's so much more work to do. And the one other thing that might be worth kind of your listeners knowing is that we did make a very deliberate move quite early on not to attempt to trace kind of legal genealogies and causal connections systematically. And that's not because we didn't think that work, isn't important or couldn't be done. I think I say in the last chapter that there is so much that to think about in terms of trans-regional connectivity. This is happening here, ergo that happened there. But it just became very apparent very quickly that again would be a different kind of comparative exercise. Yeah. Patrick, if you want to add.
No, I think you summarized it well. After all, a book is a product of the people who are writing it. So we were constrained by the people whom we had assembled. If we had done it 40 years ago, they had a different group of people would have come up with a different product. 40 years from now, there'll be a different set of priorities and people. So we can't say that this is somehow or other paradigmatic for comparative literature, comparative law of ancient world. But this is what we thought with our expertise, given the people we had, this is the best we could come up with. And and it has no normativity, that is somehow the normative for future scholarship. And as you said, animals will, I think, become a more central area of discussion in the future than it has been during our lifetimes.
So just to remind our listeners, the traditions covered in your volume include Near Eastern, Greek, Roman, Chinese, and Indian legal systems. So I can imagine that it has been challenging as well to unify these diverse research methods. And I would like to, how have you, how would you elaborate this methodology that is more aligned with social sciences than, using these traditional practices of like using exegesis, for example, for the Roman legal sources, or using other sorts of like more practical methodologies for studying these sources?
I think, again, Amelia, maybe this second meeting that we had in Cambridge, you can tell that I think of it as being quite kind of emphatic in so many different ways. And I literally remember standing up in front of our wonderful group of 20-odd expert scholars and saying, why can't we be more like the social scientists? And as we were finishing this volume 14 years later, like these words replay in my head, thinking, now I know why we don't do this in the way that the social scientists do. So I think, that there were huge joys to be had in doing this very detailed kind of, and I would say truly collaborative. So it wasn't just, we came together, we decided something, we did it. It's literally, we came together, we collaborated, we tried things out, we saw, we tested, we went back, we refined, we reanalyzed. And I think for that reason, it was quite hard to draw a line. As you've just said, I was so conscious in this group of the other things that we could have done. So that working method that I described earlier, that the lead chapter would decide on the categories and the typologies that were relevant for the particular discipline, approach, period, geographical region that they had been trained in. And then once they'd circulated their initial plan to the other experts, those experts would come in and they would critique the plan. So they were kind of critiquing the categories, the assumptions, the typologies that were in the proposed plan, not just, what's the substantive arguments here. So then once that process happened and we had an agreed structure for each chapter, then the lead chapter would put a call out, lead chapter author would put a call out for different kinds of specific information, scholarly detail from different, and then came what I think was, the really hard work of seizing control of all of this material. And I am still in awe of every single one of our lead chapter writers for, having done that literally, because it was not without its challenges, because we really wanted to get across a sense of the complexity and also the sheer vibrancy, not just of the ancient material, but the kinds of debates and discussions that we were having as experts in the room. So I genuinely hope that came through for the reader. But I've always, as you can probably tell from that final paragraph of chapter 12, I've always thought of this project as a kind of huge invitation. So it's music to my ears, Amelia, when you say, we sort of left these little breadcrumbs for people to come along and, like Hansel and Gretel, discover them and then take them up and develop in their own research. Because that's certainly the way that I always thought of it. But yeah, the collaborative methodology, having worked it out, I think it was great, but it was really tough going and hard work. And I think it was just me.
It was very difficult. Difficult on at many levels. Just want to tell you, as Carolyn said, the lead writer would come up with a structure and would consult the group that had been assigned to that chapter. They would have their recommendations, etc. And then the most difficult part of it was that, as usual, when you have that, how many people did we have altogether? 30?
So I think it was about 25, 26, because we had
25,
people who were advisors who weren't actually involved. Yeah.
And not all of them, to be frank, were equally responsive in terms of getting stuff to the lead author. So that is that's a human issue. People had other things to do with their lives rather than this. So for me, that was again a challenge. And then once I had written everything, incorporated their thoughts, it went back to them so that they can then edit what I had written from their own perspectives. So in a sense, it was truly a collaborative chapter that I wrote, that everybody wrote, in fact. Collaboration often means, in our world, 10 people writing 10 chapters. Indian law, Chinese law, etc. But this was actually 5 to 7 people together coming up with a chapter. And I think that is what this particular one is unique in that sense. I cannot, in my own experience, think of one. The only thing one can think of is some kind of a conference or workshop from which something came about. But there too, each paper would be by different people, even though they may have had the benefit of discussions with others, right? This, in fact, is actually collaboratively written too. Even though there's a lead writer, you need to have that. The others contributed substantively as the chapter evolved over time.
Has this experience added something to your impression of how to select sources? Because, I mean, for example, when you have in the chapter by David Davidson, he phrases like a kind of the sources that are used. Well, obviously, written sources are the predominant ones, but also in the chapter of property, you have used also archaeological material that I was very happy to see, because I'm always saying that law should be also looked at materially. So has this experience, expand your view about how to look at law, what is valid for people, what are the sources of law actually, if they are not only written sources like contracts?
Yeah, I would say definitely. And I think, so we were always conscious as well that we were probably speaking to multiple readerships. So, we wanted to make ourselves intelligible to those, people who would think of themselves more as doctrinal legal experts. So people who are interested in that kind of textual substantive. But we also wanted to make the book interesting and exciting and accessible for people who weren't trained doctrinally, and also just, and I think even for those doctrinal experts, looking at images and looking at oral sources is so crucially important. It just sometimes doesn't come into the conventional kind of ways of doing those scholarship that maybe you get trained to do, as Patrick says, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I think things are changing now. So we tried very hard. There's some discussion of oral traditions. There's some use of images. I pressed, it didn't take much pressing, but we pressed quite hard to ensure that there were images in the volume. Weights and measures was something that was completely revelatory. So when David was doing his chapter 11 on commerce and contracts, the difference that these kind of comparative traditions of using weights and measures and processes of standardization, I think there's so much more could be done on that too. And then the other challenge as well was just, trying to compare where we seemingly lacked evidence, both for structure and system. So sometimes it wasn't just that we didn't have the evidence to compare. It's literally that there was no evidence that there was a certain kind of structural understanding of law in any given ancient context that we were looking at. And I'm very conscious of that, because also I'm interested in kind of the ways in which the modern world can affect the structures and the ideas and the concepts that we take back to the ancient world. So things like, system of laws, administration of justice, the entire category of criminal law, or even law and custom is a really good example. Would this distinction between law and custom that we're used to thinking about in the modern world, would it work for the ancient world? And if the answer is yes, would it work in the same way for all times and places? So there was this constant kind of meta thinking going on, not just about the kind of the substantive material, the on the ground, the stuff we have evidence for, but also the categories and concepts that we were using. And it just, after 14 years, there just came a point where we needed to draw a line and get the thing finished.
Yeah, I think the categories we use, I'm sure we will come to that at some point, about religion and law. The very concept of religion, the category of religion, is very modern. To say that in the ancient world, there was no distinction between religion and law is probably anachronistic. We are trying to say that they didn't have these distinctions that we have today, which means really nothing. But one other thing that I found difficult, is that there is no single voice, scholarly voice, about anything in various legal traditions. So we had disputes and controversies. One of my experts would say one thing, and another expert, and Caroline knows whom I'm talking about, would have a completely different thing. So I, from the outside, had to now resolve, how am I going to incorporate these contradictory voices from Roman law, Greek law, into the chapter? So that was another practical issue that we had to deal with. Yeah.
I mean, on this dichotomy that you're mentioning, you really opened my mind to another key issue, like Patrick saying, that when you mentioned how the Dharma and the sources of Dharma are like explicitly discussed and explained and argued in Indian law. And that was considered religious law versus the Roman law that is secular, and that is something that should be, rethought about. And actually start thinking about how can we actually say that Roman law is secular when actually we don't really have that much general explanations, because Roman jurists are really not very big on concepts or generalizations. So I find that incredible, because I thought about so many legal scholars that might be moving on their graves now, thanks to your volume, thinking all my great work is being, shaken.
I think that's something which I think you and I have talked about previously, Amelia, because it's always struck me that that the large proportion, even if you think of what we now term the civilian legal tradition, so this long history, and there is, of course, that there are power differentials here, and why Roman law would probably be the yardstick. Okay, maybe we'll get into that, but so I think what I figured out a long time ago is that most Roman legal scholars are quite upfront about the fact that they're interested in what we would term the citizen law of the Romans. So if you define Roman private law as the law between citizens, then necessarily, the gods are there. They're just not primarily at the front of the law between citizens. And that's completely to be expected. So like you, I fear that I'm responsible for many, previous Romanists flipping in their graves, because I honestly think that this structure that Patrick's talking about in terms of Dharma, and we could think about with other traditions as well, I think it's there in Roman law. It just maybe underlies it and underpins it in a way that's not immediately clear for modern scholars, or maybe in a way that scholars since the 19th, 20th centuries have deliberately tried to place into the background and, in their processes of nation state building. But that would get us onto a different topic.
I think the centrality of Roman law, or better, Roman legal scholarship in the modern world, is insidious in this, that the early scholars whom we study of Indian law were themselves trained in Roman law. So they brought that structure to analyzing and understanding Indian law, which we, the second, third, fourth generation Indian scholars, absorbed without even knowing that this is Roman, because it is not evident. So you can see the insidious aspect of that imperialism, so to speak, of the Roman law in the legal area, right? I'm sure this is the same with regard to ancient Near Eastern law, or Egyptian law, or Chinese law, for that matter. Yeah.
That's why comparing is useful, because actually also you can trace a little bit, right? Because I think copying is a universal thing in law. You copy other practices because they work. Then you apply them to your context, and then you add a little bit of like spices of your own tradition, and that is the interesting bit on that. But it's true that if you only focus on what was copied, then you don't get out of that. Sorry, you were gonna say, Caroline.
No, I was just saying, so I think for me too, and this may just be me, so we suited me. But I was always kind of, because I think that the way that we think about modern, what William Twining called the country and Western tradition. So this idea of, sort of nation state, Western, legal, but kind of hand in hand law and state business. So I think that comes with a very peculiar kind of epistemology. And I've always been really interested in thinking, okay, does this peculiar kind of epistemology, is it some sort of natural linear development out of Roman law primarily, or is this something that was put to use, developed because of what happened, in the two major periods of colonial expansion? So yeah, I mean, and again, we had many sorts of conversations around this sort of meta question of what sorts. So I remember Patrick and I having a really interesting discussion, because I was completely, certain that HLA Hart's concept of law could only be applied to modern scenarios. And Patrick said, but why? And we had this really interesting, what's modern about the concept of law? And I think that for me is one of the huge takeaways from having done this volume. And I'm very kind of conscious that this nation state legal history trend is perhaps something that's receding from view. Now the last decade, this idea that we have, cosmopolitan global legal histories. I think there's so much that could now be done with the ancient world, thinking through these kind of cosmopolitan global legal approaches, and not just from this kind of nation state focused way of thinking about history.
And we also have now, in the last 20 years, a lot more work done on the anthropology of law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is not what we did because we were textualists in some sense. And the anthropology of law has brought a completely different view of what law is and how human societies manage their interpersonal and intergroup relationships. That's what law is, after all. And then you talked about the South versus the North globally. In the South, it will be mostly an anthropology of law kind of thing, because we don't have ancient texts for the most part from many of those areas. We have some maybe in the Mesoamericas a little bit, but not in Africa or Oceania. So you have to deal with oral traditions. And that, I think, has colored, I think in my mind, it has colored my view of what law is all about. And it's not something esoteric, Roman legal thing. It's something very common to all human beings and all human societies.
And I was wondering, because one thing that I also like about the volume is, like, I don't know if it's unconscious because of your own background of research, but I feel like there's a lot of like from bottom up approach to sources, actually. Even in the law and the state, there's actually a bottom up approach, like how does that affect the individuals, the people who are receivers of the law. So was this a conscious, or is just you were led by your own background of research?
But I think you ask a question, you may come to it later, but with regard to bottoms up, meaning socially, meaning what about the guys and girls, women and men who are not represented in the available evidence, right?
Yeah, actually.
Whether we like it or not, our evidence comes from the elites of society who had wherewithal to write, to create. Even if you have a statue, even if you have a archaeological something image, that was created by somebody who had the resources to do that, right? So in a sense, we are actually, when we are dealing with ancient law, dealing with a slice of society, whether we like it or not, and how the other 95% lived, and whether they followed this, what we see at the very top, we will never probably know exactly. There are some ways in which in India, I think we have drama, dramatic sources, and other kinds of popular literature that depict scenes in which law seems to be functioning, and that may give us some indication as to how it was done at the bottom level, but they are rare and far between. Yeah.
I think this also picks up on something that Patrick was saying before. So I think the concept of law in action is kind of obviously, and this is partly why we ended up going with a kind of separate ancient Egypt. I mean, right. To use a tradition, I think we were all a little bit uncomfortable that there was this ancient Egyptian tradition, because we knew, it obviously that's not quite correct. It's pluralistic, much more complex, but for the sake of shorthand, we used to refer to it as the sort of ancient Egyptian tradition. But, so the Egyptian papyri, and now again in the last sort of 30, 40 years, and especially for the period that I work on, we have other Near Eastern archives with which we can now begin to compare Egypt. So, providing this wealth of documentary evidence, and I think every single one of the experts who we worked with was really interested in kind of looking at legal documentary evidence as well as extra legal texts, as Patrick says. And I think that added to the richness of the project. And I know, Amelia, so the final chapter, I'm not sure if Patrick will remember this, but initially I had this idea that the final chapter would be kind of written by me on the basis of a crazy idea where I would do a kind of, 50, maybe 100-kilometer grid and just, place it over select ancient places and say how many different types of law were there within this 50k radius at any given point in time, and then kind of chart changes. And of course, it would have been nigh on impossible to do, but that idea of having a chapter that was more about law in action and showing change over time, and not just change over place, was something that I was really interested in. But as it turned out, it became manifestly clear that what the volume really needed, I think, for the final chapter was more of a sort of historiographical reflection on what we were doing and where this might go. So obviously it never happened, but the law in action chapter would have been in there if we'd had another 20 years, Patrick?
Yeah. You would have. I won't.
And like this will be like something really good for a big project, because actually, because humanities is interpretative, I think they like this sort of maps and interactive things. So that will be something very interesting actually to have to chart, and something that has not been done before. So what I was also wondering is, like, the ancient world in different periods is multilingual. Like you have like different empires with different languages. Even some of them that we don't really we cannot chart them very well following the sources. So how do you think the use of multiple languages when formulating law shed light in the context of its promulgation, the identity of its recipients, and its dissemination as well, in different contexts, of course?
Go ahead.
I've always been really interested in this idea, not so much legal pluralism, but what for want of a better term, multilegalism. So just like you can talk about multilingualism, I've played around with this idea. What would happen if you tried to reframe legal pluralism as a kind of multilegalism? So I think it's kind of interesting and important on so many different sorts of levels. And, obviously you've got a level of bilingualism, trilingualism, multilingualism to start off with. Then you've got questions about translation, and you're dealing with, especially the period that I work on, so mainly the later Roman Empire. Both Greek and Latin are, high register, high level languages, and they are both the languages of the state. But Latin has a greater cachet up until at least, the mid 6th century than Greek does. So and then you've got all this plethora of, a creation of new sorts of languages and scripts and texts. So Coptic, Syriac, by the time we get to late antiquity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is so crucial, this kind of more linguistic analysis. But then again, there are challenges to this, because as Patrick, absolutely correctly pointed out, the origins a lot of kind of comparative ancient law, rather than comparative ancient histories, but comparative ancient law, they stretch back to that 19th century period with this discovery of, these linguistic commonalities. And so I think it's quite a minefield, but it is absolutely ripe for, a scholar to look at this issue and start thinking not just in terms of legal pluralities and legal pluralism, but just thinking, multilegalism instead of multilingualism.
Yeah, I mean, India is a test case for that. India now has about 20 national languages or more. But ancient Indian texts were written primarily in 2 languages, Sanskrit for the most part, and some in Buddhist and Jain areas in several what we call Middle Indo-Aryan languages, Prakrits, Pali and others. But for the most part, it's just from a language point of view, it catches only a very small number of very elite people who could speak and write in this language. So it does not capture the normal languages, regional languages of India. And that itself creates issues, right, with regard to representation of other legal pluralism or multi-legalism that you talk about. One thing interesting in India, I'm not sure whether this is true of every higher register meta-legal thinking, recognized various levels of law and law's applicability. So you have, for example, courts that are family courts, where family law handed down within that small restricted group would prevail. Then caste law, regional law, law of guilds, and then finally you have the meta law, where the court of the king would be. So they themselves recognize different fora for resolving conflicts, as well as different laws that are applicable to those legal fora, courts. And that's very interesting, that the upper legal recognizes that there are lower and unrecorded levels. So that was an interesting thing. It is, I think, peculiar to the Indian legal system that is not found, for example, in China.
For me, again, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of this entire project, was just listening to Patrick and his fellow kind of Sanskrit experts talking about procedure in these ancient Sanskrit texts, because, it is so much more, and I'm going to use this word provocatively, but I stand by it, it's so much more sophisticated than anything that I at least have encountered in the Roman legal sources, the kind of depth of it, the complexity of it, the way in which it's being discussed and thought about and systematized, and that was a huge revelation, and led me off looking at forum shopping in the Roman Empire, for example, which I never would have thought of had I not had these conversations.
It's very interesting that I'd say 90% of Indian legal tradition is procedure. And you gather the substantive law within the discussions of procedure. So that is why it was that I wanted to write about it, first of all. And it is so unique because the other legal traditions had not spent that much time and focus on this particular aspect of law.
But then it's really interesting because you get a lot of this law in action that we were talking about. And you were talking about different fora. In that sense, I would like to pick on this concept that also Caroline mentioned before, legal pluralism, that is this trend that is also now like in many, many spheres of law. And in that sense, for example, one of the points, at least from the Roman period, is like legal plurality is also there because there's a rule of personality. Does this happen with other legal traditions? Have you encountered that? Is in Indian law a case like you can only use the law that applies to your group, your social group, or can you access every kind of law that is available?
Yeah, it depends on what sort of dispute there is. So if you are dealing with family law, that will be clearly done within the family or within the region. But if you are dealing with assault, criminal law, that will be a much broader set of laws would apply to that. So family law, inheritance, especially, I think, husband-wife family relationships, meaning divorce and getting a second wife and that those kinds of things will be within a more restricted area of law, I think. Yeah, it'll probably depend. Unfortunately, it is not, as far as I know, explicitly stated that these laws are in this forum and these other laws are in this forum. That discussion doesn't take place, but it seems to be assumed that what is settled in a family law, family court, would be things that deal with the kinds of family issues, right? If a brother takes a loan from another brother, would that go to the court of the king or whether it'll be settled within the family?
No, that is actually very interesting. I'd say I'm very different from what I actually know from other traditions. I was wondering then, as you mentioned before at the beginning, Patrick, you were talking about empires. And, like in India, you didn't have that. So sometimes imperialism has an influence on local law. But in the case of India, being kind of on your own for such a long time, does this make that you didn't have as much influence from other traditions? It was like its own thing? Or have you had, do you feel that you have had more external or, other influences on creating law?
Yeah. So it depends on what you mean by external, because there's a lot of externals in India that are within India. It's a large area.
Yeah. I guess when I mean
to
external, I mean from top down. So probably in that sense,
I see.
no,
Top
I
down.
imagine.
Yeah, right. So India, at most of its, from about the 3rd century, 4th century, India was open to the rest of the world. After all, Alexander the Great came all the way to the Indus, and there were so many. Ashoka translated some of his edicts into Aramaic and Greek. So clearly there was interaction. But in law, it's unclear what sort of Roman, or especially there was no Roman at the time, Greek legal systems influenced. I know at a little later, after Ashoka, there is a Roman epistolary tradition of writing epistles, basically letters that were publicly written, engraved on temples, etc., which had quite a strong influence on the way Indian kings produced letters that were presumably private but meant to be exhibited publicly. So there are some external such influences. But Indian law, as given in the Dharmashastras, do not envisage political boundaries. It seems to be a meta. So it's almost an international law. We had a book published in China about IR, the International Theory Workshop. And there, I think we were talking about international law, and India always had an international law if you take nation as a kingdom rather than a modern nation state. So these laws were supposed to be applied across, at least theoretically, that's what theory of the law was, across these political boundaries. And there were clearly regional differences. South Indian law had many unique features that North Indian law did not have. For example, cross-cousin marriage, that you could marry your father's sister's daughter. So there's a gender separation. Your father, if you're a man, your mother's brother's son, you could marry. That was not allowed in the law. So there are so many such regional differences in law. Interestingly, the law recognizes that and says it is okay to do that, but it is not okay to do that there. So that's the kind of thing that you have. Influence. But then there are all these areas in the middle of the North and the South where it is unclear which side they are following of this divide. So yeah, there is the law as we have it written does not generally recognize that law is regionally or geographically bound. So in that sense, you can say dharma can apply to the whole world as a general international law.
That makes it better for comparison, actually.
Right,
You don't know
exactly.
of these boundaries. Yeah. I would like also to pick on another aspect that you mentioned before, because you were talking about, well, this big question of like the people who write the law and, being elite and all that. So then as, your volume explores also law in context. So have you thought about the narratives, how the law is presented actually? And, if this can you hide a little bit what actually the law is about when you were doing these comparisons as well?
I think we definitely did, although I think when I was thinking about this, I think rather than framing it as narratives, our conversations were more about the idea of legal traditions. So I think we were all hyper conscious, as Patrick was just saying about the idea of, the connections between law as a creator of identity. So, for the Roman world, as you will well know, Emilia, this kind of Roman ideology of law as the gift of the conqueror. You can be completely conquered, your lands can be razed, your families can be sold off into slavery, but this is the gift that the conqueror gives to you because now you're civilized. So, that kind of more ideological, we thought a lot about narratives in that kind of respect and how they built into, what we might call a legal tradition. But I think legal traditions are probably where this idea of narrative comes in. And, the work that's been done, say Thomas Duvet, this idea that legal traditions are more about, what is it he says, they're more about those who construct them than about any kind of, real, authentic historical path dependencies. And I think that's what really interested us. So we never set out to just produce a taxonomy of 5 ancient, major legal traditions. It was always a kind of heuristic. But we worked with this idea that there were these recognizable things that we could call traditions because they had this interlinked narrative, and these narratives had been created over huge, millennia. They weren't just, in construction at the time at which we were writing. So I think definitely narrative has been really, really interesting and important, but in that kind of longue durée, which was challenging for me because in my own research, I much prefer to draw smaller circles, so I like the kind of, as far as we can, what's happening on the ground, what are the realities? That's so trying to do it over this sort of longer durée and think about the narratives that we've constructed in the modern world and we tell to ourselves for certain reasons, as well as the narratives that were constructed in the ancient world, that all became bundled up in this idea of traditions. And the serious debates we had about how to frame these 5 so-called traditions. And at one point we thought about calling them systems, but we abandoned that. And I hopefully that language has not remained in the volume, though a bit of it may have sneaked in. But it's very difficult. And all these terms are value laden, right? If you call something a legal system, there are already all sorts of presuppositions built into that I personally think have to do with Western rationality, et cetera, et cetera.
About the tradition, even the ability to demarcate and say, this is Egyptian or this is Roman. And that is something that we assumed, but it's not all. We have to deal with that. I think there's a linguistic boundary. So the Chinese is written in Chinese, Indian is written in some Indian language, Sanskrit derived, etc., like Greek. But there is also this, you talked about influence, but there's also a tradition in the sense of diachronic tradition. So we are talking about a long, 1,000-year tradition where there is consciousness on the part of the later writers of what went before them and dealing with that. So in a sense, it is a tradition that is self-conscious, that it belongs to this tradition. So in that sense, it creates that kind of a internal cohesion that we can then from the outside say, okay, that is a tradition.
I did have many sleepless nights, Emilia, over this question of essentializing, because, I hated the idea that we would produce this volume where it looked like we'd essentialized these 5 legal traditions and flattened out all of this incredible variety and complexity. And that was kind of what we didn't want to do. And then very funnily, after the whole thing had gone in, my colleague Lina Salema, who specializes in the kind of early Islamic period, took one look at what we'd done. And she said, well, you do realize that Near Eastern is a label that comes from modern colonial Oh my God. So I think trying to identifying the kind of blind spots in my own eyes is a continuing learning experience. Yeah.
Actually, when you go to India and talk, they use a different word for that area of the world,
Yeah.
West Asia,
Yeah.
the West Asian countries. Well, over here we call it Near East. Yeah, so there we go.
Yeah, so this was also like a self-study of oneself and how you see things. So I really like that you also were mentioning that, Patrick, that sometimes we look at a source and we think, okay, this is Greek or this is, Indian or this is Chinese or something. And then immediately, yeah, our prejudices come in. So this is something that is a discourse that I have to say you have done very well in this book, but also something that is happening in archaeology too. Like there's this book I have here with me, this Reconstructing a Maritime Past, that actually is talking about when we see a ship and we actually see, oh, this is Greek architect. And then we are narrowing our way to understand the material. So actually you are talking about something very broad. And I think it's very important what you're mentioning here.
I mean, we understood the difficulties of any kind of label that we would give to a tradition. But if we don't, then where do we go? How do we deal with that, right? Even when that is the issue of human brain, in human thought, as well as human language. We do label things. And the moment we label, this whole thing of sociology of knowledge, right? Once you label, you think that it is out there. Just like we talked earlier about religion. There is something called religion. And in India, did religion and law, those things out there in the world, connect or the same, without realizing that religion is basically a category that we have created. And there may be or may not be something that is connected to that. Somebody is tilling the land for a crop. Is that a religious act or an economic act?
Or is it a customary act? Because you mentioned custom before, like Caroline, and custom is such a complicated topic as well.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
So just to wrap up, because I have abuse of your kindness for a long time now. So what can we expect in the future of comparison in ancient law or in law in general? And what future research paths do you envision?
I leave that to the boss.
Deep intake. So I think, I've thought long and hard, what's the takeaway from this? I've spent so long and we've all invested so much energy. And I think for me, definitely just the sheer fact that Rome was not the only ancient legal tradition that developed a specifically legal body of knowledge, nor was it the only ancient society to write down that legal body of knowledge. That for me is a massive takeaway. And it's not that this fact is unknown. It's just that I don't think it's repeated enough. And I don't think a lot of the big research projects that we run today really takes that fact on board. And I think then, all the ancient material that we discussed and that we encountered and we used in the volume, just this idea that human creativity can overcome lawlessness. That seems to me to be something which all of these ancient, thinkers, writers, doers agreed upon. And this even for ancient Greek writers, as I understand it, that they even go so far as to say that if there is disorder and lawlessness in the cosmos, right, the human brain can impose a kind of order where there wasn't one. And I find that in the current context of the climate crisis, all the sort of various huge 21st, I just think that's such a fantastic message that we scholars of ancient law, ancient societies can offer to the modern world, that it is within our power to construct well-ordered human associations, that we can strive for good or lawful order at the same time as, arguing over what the criteria good and lawful might be. So I think that's one thing that we can definitely take away. And I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of ancient, what I might call ancient constitutional imaginaries. So literally, and also how we think of ourselves in terms of the environment, how we frame ourselves. There are so many new avenues that could be developed. And to do that, I certainly, speaking personally, have had to step outside the Roman kind of legal training and the Roman historical background that I have. And encountering all these other various different traditions has enabled me to do that in a way that just wouldn't have been possible if I'd stuck with that kind of scholastic training that I received as a PhD student and an early career scholar. But I don't know, Patrick, what do you think?
Well, law and order in America has over time meant the oppression of some people and the upholding of the rights of others, right? So law doesn't necessarily mean justice, morality, or moral order. So it is clear that that the people who made laws and enforced laws were particular people at a particular class of society in the ancient as well as today. But I think on the other hand, at least coming from an Indian perspective, Ashoka, writing in the middle of the 2nd century to his officials, talk about equality in dispensing justice. And that, I think, is called Vyavahara Samatha. Sameness of Vyavahara is for judicial procedure. That's the word. So the procedure should be implemented same for everybody. In other words, not taking an individual's position in society. And that's an interesting aspect of ancient law, even though it may have supported particular class of society and not others. There was a certain view that there should be justice, meaning that everybody, the old American or Western saying, everybody should be the same in the eyes of the law. That is there in the legal procedure section of the Indian law, even though we must recognize that it was implemented from above on people at the bottom. And what today we would call injustice, including slavery, was part of the legal system in most of these societies, right?
I think so. Just if I can add, just listening to Patrick speak, because I think what also is really fascinating, and I'm less certain ground here, but I think that this idea that just understanding that this connection. So if we're looking at the ancient world, law is not necessarily a language of state. And I think that, I'm just finished reading this book by Carlo Torri called Properties of Law, Modern Law and After. And this idea that, that there is a period that we are now in where law is not just the language of state, right? There is transnational law. There's law under the state, beyond the state, above the state, etc. And I think the ancient world is really good to think with in terms of this period that we are now entering, this kind of post-national law. And that's not to say that nation states aren't important. Obviously they are, but there are so many kind of connections that I find when I talk to scholars of transnational law, global law, in ways that are just, quite frankly, weird, when you start to think about the way in which the ancient world. So I think those sorts of dialogues are incredibly fruitful. And I really hope that our book might encourage young scholars who, to be ambitious and to go out and to talk to people beyond their immediate disciplines and do this kind of thinking. Because I do think that the study of comparative ancient law, legal societies, I think it does have something to offer the 23rd century, never mind just the 21st century.
Yeah, so your volume is not only a manifesto for comparative, but also for interdisciplinarity, and that is very important in the current scheme of research actually. So thank you very much for this talk, Caroline and Patrick, and it's been lovely to talk with you. Thank you very much for your time. And well, I hope for the best, maybe for a second volume of this comparative history of ancient law.
Yeah, I think it would need a fresh team. That's fair to say, isn't it, Patrick?
Thank you very much, Emilia, for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
Interesting conversation.
Genuine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for being here.
Bye-bye.